New findings hint at the true reasons for the decline of this ancient civilization. Alice and Kira Carter from The Conversation on Science Alert. This was built in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, one of the most famous kings of the Angkorian civilization. This is the Temple of Angkor. The Angkorian civilization that lasted from approximately the 9th to the 15th centuries. The structure is so strongly associated with Cambodian identity even today that it appears on the nation's flag. For many years, historians placed the collapse of the Angkor civilization in 1431, when Angkor's capital city was sacked by the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya and abandoned. The idea that the Angkorian capital was abandoned also played a part in the 19th century colonial interpretation of Angkor as a civilization forgotten by the Cambodians and left to decay in the jungle. Many tourists still come to Angkor Wat with an outdated romanticized notion of the deserted ruin emerging from the mysterious jungle, but scholars have long argued against this interpretation, and archaeological evidence is shedding even more light on the decline of the Angkorian civilization. The process was much longer and more complex than previously imagined. Angkor's collapse may be better described as a transformation. By looking at the events associated with this one particular temple, archaeologists like me are able to see a microcosm of some of the broader regional transformations that took place across Angkor. Now, what happened to the Angkor civilization? Researchers believe the Angkor civilization was established 802 AD. Its heartland and capital city was on the banks of the Tonle Sap Lake in northwest Cambodia. The Angkorian state was founded and grew during a period of favorable climate with abundant rainfall. At its height, Angkorian rulers might have controlled a large portion of the mainland Southeast Asia. The Angkor civilization was booming in the early 1100s when construction began on the Angkor Wat temple site, built as a recreation of the Hindu universe. Its most striking features are the 5 sandstone towers that rise above the 4 temple enclosures, representing the peaks of Mount Meru, which was supposedly the center of the universe. The temple is surrounded by a large moat, symbolizing the Sea of Milk, from which Amrita, quote-unquote, an elixir of immortality, was created. But by the end of the 13th century, numerous changes were taking place. The last major stone temple at Angkor was constructed in 1295, and the latest Sanskrit inscription dates to the same year. The last inscription in Khmer, the language of Cambodian, appears a few decades later in 1327. Constructing stone temples and writing inscriptions are elite activities. These last instances at the Angkorian temple capital happened during the region-wide adoption of Theravada Buddhism that replaced Hinduism. This religious shift disrupted the pre-existing Hindu-based power structures. Emphasis moved from state-sponsored stone temples and royal bureaucracy to community-based Buddhist pagodas built from wood. At the same time, maritime trade with China was increasing. The relocation of the capital further south near the modern capital of Phnom Penh allowed rulers to take advantage of these economic opportunities. Paleoclimate research has highlighted region-wide environmental changes that were taking place at the time as well. A series of decades-long droughts, interspersed with heavy monsoons, disrupted Angkor's water management network meant to capture and disperse the water. One study of the moats around the walled urban precinct of Angkor Thom suggests the city's elite were already departing by the 14th century, almost 100 years before the supposed sack of the capital by Ayutthaya. Excavations in the Angkor Wat temple enclosure. My colleagues and I, in collaboration with the government's Asparsa authority that oversees Angkor Archaeological Park began excavating within Angkor Wat's temple enclosure in 2010. Instead of focusing on the temple itself, we looked at the occupation mounds surrounding the temple. In the past, people would have constructed houses and lived on top of these mounds. LiDAR surveys in the region clarify that Angkor Wat and many other temples included nearby Tai Prom were surrounded by a grid system of mounds within their enclosures. Over 3 field seasons, my colleagues and I excavated these mounds, uncovering remains of dumps of ceramics, hearths, and burnt food remains, post holes, and flat-laying stones that might have been part of a floor, surface, or a path. It's not clear yet who lived on these mounds, as we've not yet found artifacts that give clues as to the inhabitants' occupants and their occupations. Inscriptions describing the thousands of people needed to keep the temples functioning, so we suspect that many of those who lived on the mounds worked in some capacity in the Angkor Wat temple, perhaps as religious specialists, temple dancers, musicians, or other laborers. During our excavations, we collected burnt organic remains, primarily pieces of wood charcoal that were associated with different layers or features like hearths. Using radiocarbon dating, we identified dates for 16 charcoal pieces. We used these dates to build a more fine-grained chronology of when people were using the temple enclosure space, providing a more nuanced idea of the timing of occupation at Angkor Wat. Radiocarbon dates tell a different story, though. Our dates show that the landscape around Angkor Wat might have initially been inhabited in the 11th century, prior to the temple's construction in the early 12th century. Then the Angkor Wat temple enclosure landscape included the mound pong grid system was laid out. People subsequently inhabited the mounds. Then we have a gap or break in our radiocarbon dates. It's difficult to line it up with the calendar years, but we think it likely ranges from the 12th or early 13th century to the late 14th or 15th century. This gap coincides with many of the changes taking place across Angkor, and based on our excavations, it seems that the occupation mounds were abandoned or their use was transformed during this period. However, the temple of Angkor Wat itself was never abandoned, and the landscape surrounding the temple appears to be reoccupied by the late 14th century or early 15th. During the period, Angkor was supposedly sacked and abandoned by Ayutthaya and used until the 17th or 18th centuries. The timeline of Angkor Wat, even as region-wide changes swept through the Angkor civilization, the Angkor Wat temple was never completely abandoned. In the date 802 AD, King Jayavarman II established the Angkor state. 1113 to approximately 1150, the reign of King Suryavarman II. The early mid-11,000s, exact date unknown, construction of the Angkor Wat by King Suryavarman. 11,000s are construction of the mound pond grid system and habitation on top of the mounds surrounding Angkor Wat. The late 1100s to early 1200s to late 13 or early 1400s, radiocarbon date gap, change or abandonment in use of occupation mounds around Angkor Wat. 1295, the last stone temple constructed at Angkor. Angkor Wat was a microcosm of the civilization. As one of the most important Angkorian temples, Angkor Wat can be seen as a kind of bellwether for broader developments of the civilization. It seems to have undergone transformations in the same time that the broader Angkorian society was also reorganizing. Significantly, though, Angkor Wat was never abandoned. What can be abandoned is the tired cliche of foreign explorers, quote-unquote, discovering lost cities in the jungle. While it seems clear that the city experienced a demographic shift, certainly key parts of the landscape were not deserted. People returned to Angkor Wat and its surrounding enclosure during the period that historical chronicles say the city was being attacked and abandoned. To describe Angor's decline as a collapse is a misnomer. Ongoing archaeological studies are showing that the Angorian people were reorganizing and adapting to a variety of turbulent, changing conditions. This by Alison Kira Center, Assistant Professor at, Alison Kira Carter, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Oregon. This article republished from a conversation under Creative Commons license. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.